There isn't a genetic challenge to all of us being descended from Adam and Eve, with one proviso, based on what we see in Genesis 2, with these four rivers coming together in the Garden of Eden. That can only happen when sea levels are about 200 feet lower than they are today, which implies that the Garden of Eden event happened during an ice age. 50 years ago, they were saying, well, from a naturalistic perspective, we have to be descended from 1 million individuals. Then the number dropped to 100,000. Francis Collins in his book said 10,000. Fuzz Rana, my colleague, when he debated Dennis Venema, Dennis said 1,200. Then I heard the number 800. When I debated the president of BioLogos, she said we could go as low as 130. And I'm saying, let's plot a graph. It seems like we're heading down towards the biblical 2. Moreover, what we now recognize is that you can't use the genetic diversity of a mammalian species to determine the ancestral population. And they've done field studies on this, where they'll put, say, a pair of sheep on an island where no mammals exist at all. They look at their genetics, and then they come back many years later and look at the genetics of, say, 10 generations of offspring. And what they discover, you get way more genetic diversity from those two sheep than you'd expect from any of the mathematical genetics models, which tells me those models are mathematically too simple. And genetics is a complicated discipline. I'm not surprised by that. But what they have discovered is you get the greatest departure where you have a mammal species with a long generation time, meaning a long time between being born and being able to reproduce. Well, guess what? We human beings have the longest, or near the longest, generation time. And therefore, we would expect the greatest departure. Bottom line, there isn't a genetic challenge to all of us being descended from Adam and Eve, with one proviso. We can't put Adam and Eve as recent as 6,000 years ago. In fact, I would argue, based on what we see in Genesis 2, with these four rivers coming together in the Garden of Eden, that can only happen when sea levels are about 200 feet lower than they are today, which implies that the Garden of Eden event happened during an ice age. So it's not 6,000 or 10,000 years ago. It's probably in the neighborhood of 50,000 to 150,000 years ago, which is right in line with even the naturalistic genetic models of how far back in time you have to go to get us descended from one man and one woman. So that's one example.
Now, for a person who hears that and that makes sense to them, but they have read the first few chapters of Genesis and they remember it describing a different timeline, a different series of events, can you kind of help walk through your interpretation of how you would reconcile these two or sort of realms, the sort of the scientific genetic realm that you're talking about, right, and then the description given in the Bible?
Well, a lot of theologians are saying we can no longer scientifically defend the creation accounts of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. My response is, well, you can't if you use your interpretive approach. But if we use the biblical testing method, aka the scientific method, it can be done. So step one of the scientific method, don't interpret until you first establish the frame of reference or the point of view. Well, in Genesis 1:1, that reference frame is a universe. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens and the earth is an ancient Hebrew idiom that refers to the entire universe. They didn't have a word for universe. They used that phrase instead. But when you go to Genesis 1:2, the frame of reference has changed from the universe to the surface of the earth. The Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth. Now, step two of that scientific method, don't interpret until you also establish the starting conditions. Well, Genesis 1:2 states that for us. The Spirit of God was hovering on the surface of the waters of planet Earth, and it was dark on the surface of the waters, and the water covered the whole surface of the earth, and the earth was empty of life and unfit for life. And you get a good parallel in Job 38, where it explains why it was dark on the surface of the waters. how God had blanketed the earth with clouds that kept the seas dark. And we know that the primordial earth had an atmosphere 200 times thicker than it has today. That atmosphere would not let any visible light get through to the surface of the earth. But creation day 1, it says, let there be light. And we now know there was a collision event between the early earth and a fifth rocky planet, Theia, and that collision event stripped almost all the water and atmosphere from the primordial earth. That now allowed light to get through to the surface of the waters. And you can go step by step through 2. That's about the water cycle. Day 3, continents appear for the first time. And we know that that collision event between those two rocky planets, it gave Earth powerful plate tectonics, and those tectonics would have made the continents. You would have had life proliferating in the continents. Then the atmosphere goes transparent on the 4th day. We know why, because the life that God created pumped oxygen in the atmosphere, and that cleared out the haze and allowed animals on the surface of the earth to actually see the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. Bottom line, following that biblical testing method, you see that Genesis 1's description of the creation events, everything is in the correct chronological order, and everything is correctly described with respect to the well-established scientific record. Then you get into Genesis 2. And what I've been noticing, these theologians see that as a recasting. I don't see it that way. I look at Genesis 1 as focusing on the physical aspects of creation. Genesis 2 focuses on the spiritual aspects. What's happening in Genesis 2, God is introducing Adam first to the physical creation, then the soulish creation, and last of all the spiritual creation, and instructing them how he's going to be able to manage it, because that's what God said in Genesis 1. He gave humans a mandate to manage the resources of the planet for their benefit and the benefit of all life.
That is really interesting. I wanna make sure I am understanding how these different pieces fit together. So when you're talking about I love what you said, that if you were to plot it on a chart, you see us getting closer to 2. So I think that that's really interesting. And I want to understand your view, though. Are those 2 made ex nihilo, or do you see them as you're nodding your head? So yes, Adam and Eve were made ex nihilo.
Yes, and what you see in Genesis 1 is it uses 2 verbs to describe God bringing into existence human beings. He made them and he created them, asa and bara. The verb asa, manufacture, means that God personally took the dust of the earth and made the physical bodies of Adam and Eve. But it also used the words bara, which means to create something brand new that did not exist before. And he breathed into them his spirit. And so we humans became not just a physical body, not just a body with mind, will, and emotions that we share with birds and mammals that the Genesis 1 talks about on creation day 5, is that he made us spirit beings, which means that we're able to communicate with the Creator himself. Notice that the birds and mammals, they're designed to communicate to a higher species, namely us human beings. God designed us likewise so we could communicate to a higher being, namely God himself, but we're the only species on earth that has that capacity. And even from an atheistic perspective, notice that humans are the only species that has ever existed on earth that asks the question, is there a God? Can I relate to that God? Is there meaning beyond my life here on earth? I mean, I've got a very intelligent dog. That dog never addresses those philosophical issues.
Yeah, exactly. I love, I think it's G.K. Chesterton who noted that we would never read a 12-part series on cow pastures and cow behaviors because there's no story. They just eat grass, procreate, walk around. There's no will, there's no overcoming, there's no questioning, there's no story. It's just cows on a plot of land, which is, I think...
You don't see a bunch of cows gathering together around their food tray and discussing philosophy.
Exactly. If you guys like these conversations at the intersection of science, philosophy, and Christianity as much as I do, I have to recommend this book to you right here called Noah's Flood Revisited by Hugh Ross. For centuries, the biblical account of Noah's flood has sparked controversy. That's true.
But to me, it's just not reasonable.
Some reject it as a myth. That's definitely true.
We already know how bad their math is.
Others struggle to reconcile it with a loving God.
This is obviously not evidence of Noah's flood.
In Noah's Flood Revisited, Reasons to Believe founder and astrophysicist Hugh Ross uncovers fresh insights from both scripture and science, showing how recent discoveries illuminate the historical reality of the flood and why it matters today. This book addresses really interesting topics like what are the stumbling blocks, what are the misconceptions. Obviously, we want to get into that. Regardless of if you're a Christian or not, there's flood accounts coming out of cultures all around the world. That's an undeniable fact, but what do we make of it? Which flood is the flood? He gets into dealing with this question before the scientific revolution, then the debate beginning. This book lays a groundwork and makes tremendous progress in terms of bringing clarity to this gigantically important issue. So I highly recommend that you guys check this book out, Noah's Flood Revisited. How can we best make sense of this biblical flood account in light of what we now know to be true scientifically?